atu rā e te iwi, kua naru atu nei ki te urata. Haere atu rā, haere atu rā, haere atu rā. Tēnā koutou katoa e ngā hoa akunga. Our group's part of this story covers the years 1865 to 1895, 7 years after the conclusion of the New Zealand Wars. Tom will be presenting the big picture, which lays out some of the factors affecting Māori health and the well-being during this time. Christian will then discuss the various illnesses and the diseases prevalent at the time and give some examples of the number of outbreaks and the number of fatality. Gina will then cover the politics of the time and discuss how various government policies had an effect upon the health and well-being of Māori. My part of the presentation focuses on the health impacts to Māori of these factors from a Te Whare Tapa Whā point of view, and Shelley will then close by summarising our main points.
The big picture. The late 1800s were a time of enormous change in New Zealand, including the rapid rise in immigration of Europeans, contrasted by the rapid decline in the Maori population. This was due to both the New Zealand Wars, as well as the rapid proliferation of illnesses and diseases which the Maori, like many other indigenous peoples, had no natural immunity to. Another major factor is that Europeans were mostly living in towns and cities where healthcare could be easily delivered. The Maori, on the other hand, were fewer in number and geographically dispersed. This meant that healthcare could not be easily delivered, even if there was a desire to do so. The 1800s were also challenging times economically, so whatever funds were available tended to be spent on the immigrant population's health needs and not on Maori healthcare, which was not seen as a priority. Another major factor in the health of Maori is proximity to domesticated animals. For many thousands of years, Europeans evolved alongside animals including pigs, sheep, cattle and chickens, and over time built up immunity to numerous infectious diseases borne by the livestock and transferred to humans. For example, both bird flu and COVID-19 are widely believed to have originated in various Chinese wet markets, where live animals are butchered to order. In Africa, the Ebola virus is believed to be caught from butchering monkeys. Other than Kuri, the Maori had no need to keep domesticated animals because they could simply walk up to a moa and knock it on the head. This helps to explain why many indigenous peoples around the world sometimes have lower immunity to many infectious diseases compared to Western cultures.
The historical pattern of epidemics in New Zealand reflects its isolation and relatively small population. The long sea voyage to New Zealand in the 19th century meant that most infectious diseases had died out by the time ships arrived. European settlers brought new diseases to New Zealand in the early 19th century. Maori had a little or no natural immunity to these diseases, so suffered heavy mortality, particularly from measles and influenza. Unlike in other countries where male and female deaths were about equal, New Zealand death rates for males were double those for females in the worst affected age groups. The Maori death rate was more than 8 times that for Pakeha. The highest regional death rates for Pakeha were in Southland, King Country, Wellington and Auckland. Auckland City had the largest Pakeha death toll at 1,138. Nationwide, 135 Pakeha children lost both parents, while 6,415 lost one. Typhoid was one of the most common diseases of 19th century in New Zealand. It's transmitted by water, milk or food contaminated by feces or an infected person. It's caused by the bacterium Salmonella enterica typhi, which produce symptoms of high fever, sweating, diarrhea, headache and cough. Typhoid was especially prevalent in fast-growing towns or on the goldfields, where cesspits often leaked into water supplies. Infants and young children were especially vulnerable. Registered typhoid deaths in New Zealand peaked at 323 in 1875.
Politics. The economic depression of 1885 to 1990 led to the collapse of the economy. Prices including timber, wool and flax with the massive influx of people to the country really struggled financially with so many changes during this time. It would have put a massive strain on Parliament. The Great Migration of 1871 to 1890. This migration was the most significant migration in New Zealand history until recent years. Over this time, more than 289,000 men, women and children entered the country, although 40% of them decided to move on in 1874. There was an addition of over 38,000 immigrants. This affected New Zealand by bringing in a lot of different viruses, illnesses that Maori people were not accustomed to. It also put a lot of strain on hospitals. The 1870s Act opened up Europeans to come to New Zealand. This was mainly German and Scandinavians. In October 1870, a ship left London with 40 settlers from Norway. And Sweden. Over the next several years, thousands arrived by subsidised passage. These were mainly forestry workers and railway workers. These people settled mainly in Waitemata and Gore. Within 10 years, 5,000 Germans were born in New Zealand. There was a big force put on attracting British migrants to New Zealand. From 1873, the fare of $5 per adult was taken away. Now travelling to New Zealand was free. Julius Vogel's Immigration and Public Work Bill entered Parliament in 1870. He was the 8th Premier of New Zealand. He set about getting a better class of immigrant to New Zealand. It was the most ambitious development in New Zealand history. In doing this, he caused a flood of people to New Zealand by offering a free or assisted passage to New Zealand. Almost half of the New Zealand immigrants came with government assistance. 3/4 sailed directly from United Kingdom. He also borrowed overseas funds so he could pay for buildings, railroads and large-scale immigration. This would not only create an economic boom but a large-scale land purchase. This came from the Immigration Public Works Act of 1870. Vogel also did employment in public works scheme for the Maori to introduce them to European economy. He said later in Britain in 1893 that this scheme was the sole alternative to war with the natives. The New Zealand hospital system underwent both a major expansion and significant changes between 1860 and 1890. From 1852 to 1876, the hospitals were controlled by the provisional government, and from 1877 to 1875 they were overseen by the central government. The Hospitals and Charitable Institution Act of 1855 established a system of hospital administrations based on local hospital boards. Also, Maori Representation Act 1876 was when Maori finally got seats in Parliament. Otago Medical School Act established under the Autonomy Act 1875. Native school teachers were supplied with simple medicine. First, the effects of these acts was the complete change in how Maori dealt with their health, deaths and burials. This must have been a big shock and a massive change. This caused them a loss in Maori customs and traditions.
Hauora. In traditional Māori terms, health is an all-embracing concept that emphasises the importance of wairoa, spiritual, whānau, family, henenaro, mental and tinana, physical aspects. Māori lived historically, which contrasts with the traditional Western model, in which the physical aspects of health and sickness are emphasized. Māori were described by the early European observers as strong, raw-boned, well-made, active people, rather above than under the common size, especially the men. Māori tattoo wounds, mokos, would also heal at twice the rate compared to Europeans. Between the 1860s and the 1870s, land was alienated from the tribes, which created a shift, and Māori health and population started to decline. By the 1890s, Māori living conditions were appalling, and they were living in makeshift camps, or kerosene houses with dirt flooring without sanitation. They had then been struck with infectious diseases that were introduced from colonisation. Māori mortality was at its highest. Māori received little medical aid. They rarely used doctors and or admitted themselves to hospital. Māori holistic views and their ways of living and healing was through rongo Māori and tohunga. That's how they maintained their good health. But between the time frame allocated to us, 1865 to 1895, deadly diseases were brought here from the Europeans. Unfortunately, Māori's immune system and rongoa practices couldn't fight the diseases, so Māori population decreased in just 42,000. Okay, Wairoa, spiritual. European churches were introduced, which created conflict between Te Ao Māori views of spiritual healing. The concepts of whakamā best describes how the trauma of colonisation manifested during this time. It encapsulates the subtitle shades of shame, anxiety, humiliation, and the powerlessness that would have sat alongside pure anger and terror. Whānau, that's connection and family. The effect of being cast off ancestral land. Also, our wahine was taken as sex slaves to the Europeans. Some of our wahine had children to them or had families before taken. This affects whānau heaps. Whānau was also gifted to other tribes to strengthen bloodlines and land claims. Hinenaro, the mental health and minds. Māori were caught up in multiple moral dilemmas. For example, they couldn't win against the immigrants, nor could they afford to lose. When caught up in dilemma, the only thing that one can do is play for time and hope that the problem goes away. A lot of Māori whānau don't believe in mental illness. They believe that a lot of their thoughts and emotion linked to your tūpuna's callings or your gift that you are not educated in using. Tinana, physical. Māori were in good physical health when discovered. Mirimiri and romirome also were used to treat mamae on the tinana and hinenaro, which Māori carry. This method of practice is still often used today.
In conclusion, the Māori health for our Māori people reflected the suffering over the years caused by the colonisation of New Zealand. The impact of health over the years has had on the Māori people, such as illnesses and diseases that were brought through in 1865 and 1895. Māori had no natural immunity, suffered rapidly, reducing the Māori population from 100,000 down to just 42,000. In those years, different acts were put in place to improve the health and well-being of the Māori people. Even so, the intermediate effects of war were devastating on our Māori communities. Even before physical warfare ceased, however, this legislative warfare only enabled the alienation of Māori for land. Tribal communities not only lost their land, but people also lost control over their lives, and in the meantime, infectious diseases continued to ravage communities. The Māori population hit rock bottom in 1896 with only 42,000 men, women and their children. Māori also battled to retain residual land holdings, and leaders diversified in their political attempts to address the toll of colonisation. this period, the government had no little reason to negotiate anything with Māori at that time.